And whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Now here are the more significant verses. To you then who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, a rock that makes them fall. You can imagine they're starting to think, this is what happened with Jesus, right? They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. Now here's the verse that Luther will use multiple times, over and over again, to talk about this. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. Right? That's a direct reference to the book of Exodus. The idea of a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Luther will absolutely take these verses and hold on to them. So, that moves us into, that's the scriptural basis for Luther's understanding of a priesthood of all believers. Now there are other verses that make a direct reference. Revelation chapter 1 verse 5 is an example of one, but there's a few of them. And you'll hear some in some of Luther's writings that will be read today. But Luther takes these verses and says, so the church is Israel, and Israel itself, all of Israel, is a priesthood. So that's an important half of the fuel, really, for Luther's development of this concept of the priesthood of all believers. We'll talk about the other half in just a second. Let me see. I'll keep that there for now. Luther's priesthood of all believers, the theological view. First of all, it's important to note that Luther never actually used the term priesthood of all believers. Awkward, right? He used the term priesthood of all the baptized. But somehow that's developed into this concept, which isn't just Luther's concept. For example, Calvin, another great reformer that came along at relatively the same time, but in a different place as Luther, would use the concept of it as well. So it's more of a Protestant concept, although the Second Vatican Council that happened in the early 60s used the term as well, not as a reaction against the church, but kind of gave their own definition of it as well. So it's really it's a fascinating thing. This concept I think became especially important because of Luther's context. So picture this young German monk who is there in the midst of the church and sees a situation that is actually absolutely contrary to his faith, especially his faith that he developed while studying and interpreting or translating the Bible. He read these scriptures in Romans chapter 12, for example. You know, he translated them and became so familiar with them and made so many great connections that he then he looked at the church at his time and he realized that the church leadership of his time was disempowering the people who were members of the church. And there are so many examples of how they were doing it, in some cases what seemed to be deliberately, but in some cases not even deliberately. For example, the language, right? The language was Latin, but people in Germany who went to church didn't know Latin. So it was hocus pocus, right? It was this language that they couldn't understand. They weren't being fed, right? The gospel. That's just one example. One word for a couple of words for it are clericism. Have you heard that word before? Was it talked about a little bit last week? Another word, and this is a great one, sacerdotalism. You know, you can't make this stuff up, right? Don't worry, you're not going to be quizzed on these words, right? But the idea of that, and to a certain extent it still exists in some ways, is that the clergy are spiritually different than other people. There is a difference between spiritual people and temporal people. And speaking of spiritual people, Ruth, everybody, no, I'm just kidding, sorry. It is, by the way, if you're coming in late, you're totally fine. The way we had to configure this class was that the entrance is over here, so you are going to be on the spot. So everybody be nice to people who come in, okay? Don't glare at them, okay? Or cough at them, Al. Don't do that either. But what Luther saw going on at the time was they were making this strong distinction between people who were priests, clerics, I'll use that more general term, but they were somehow more pure. They were what was called spiritual people versus other people who were temporal or unspiritual. That's what clericism is, right? The tendency to separate people who are clerics, right? Does that all make sense? You with me? Luther hated this concept. The reason he hated this concept is because of the number one issue of the entire Reformation. I would love that the priesthood of all believers be the number one issue, but it's not. The number one issue of all the Reformation was the issue of justification. And what he said was, none of us are any better than anybody else. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Oh wait, that was Paul. But really, Luther really liked that Paul said that, which in Luther's eyes made us all equal. And the idea of making somebody better than the other, or making somebody, more importantly, making somebody beyond the need of the one priest, the high priest, right, of his salvation, was the worst thing. We're all in need of what the high priest has done for us. And the high priest is simply a reference to what Jesus did for us. If you want to read a great book in the Bible that talks about what Jesus did for us as the high priest, the book of Hebrews, right, is the book to read. Jesus is referred to as the high priest in that book. So Martin Luther had this strong reaction. And this happened in his writings pretty early on in his career. Although it's hard to, it happened in 1520. Is that pretty early on in his career? Okay, so the nailing of the 95 Thesis was in 1517. He was like 35 at the time, right? By the way, I'm 47. It just makes me feel so inadequate. Yeah. But he 3 years later, he was being. You can imagine one of the big issues for him was he caused a firestorm. And so people wanted to know more about what was behind his thinking, what was behind his theology. And this was one of the concepts that he used to explain how his theology of justification worked itself out. It was also his way to really criticize the priest or the leadership of the church at the time. One of the tracts that he wrote was a tract that he wrote to the governors of his Germany. They're like, Luther, if we're going to back you up, we want to know what you're talking about. Does that make sense? Are you still with me? Okay. So he wrote this letter called "To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation." Right? And by the way, Luther wrote prolifically. He wrote all the time. I had a professor in seminary that said, Luther doesn't have an unpublished thought, right? Right? Like there is so much, right? And if you like me, what you want to do is, gosh, I want to study Luther, so I'm just going to read his writings. It is not easy to read, right? It's 500 years old. It's contextual, right? He is is reacting to some things. It's also, as famously, I think this may be talked about in this class, the way he writes is polemic, which means he takes sides, right? And he's not politically correct, right? Luther was definitely not even in his day. But surprisingly, in some ways, not conservative, but more on that kind of well, I'll talk about that in just a second. So he wrote this letter explained to the nobility. He wrote it in German, which is a significant thing. When he was writing in German, it was his way to get information out to the people of his country. When he wanted to do more scholarly work, he would write in what language? Latin, absolutely. And he knew Greek and Hebrew. The guy was clearly brilliant. That was a huge understatement right there, but just had to say it. This is a quote from his to the Christian nobility of the German nation. Here you can see the polemic style of his writing. That the Pope or Bishop anoints, makes tonsures, ordains, consecrates or dresses differently from the laity may make a hypocrite or an idolatrous oil-painted icon, but it in no way makes a Christian or a spiritual human being. In fact, we are all consecrated priests through baptism. As St. Peter in 1 Peter 2, verse 9 says, "You are a royal priesthood and a priestly kingdom." It's funny, our NRSV translates it holy nation. But anyway, and Revelation 5:10 says, "Through your blood you have made us into priests and kings." So can you see here where this is the first recorded writing of this concept of a priesthood of all baptized, right? And you can see first of all, he's not suggesting that the Pope or bishops are all bad, right? It's just that they are able to do these holy things, or these things that are deemed holy. It might make them hypocritical. I mean, it's also their job, right? It's just an important. This is an important quote. Does this one make sense?
What is tonsures?
Tonsures, makes tonsures. Does anybody know what that is? Go ahead, Jack.
It's the thing around their head.
Oh, okay. Kind of
The
the
ring.
yeah. They put it's the ring around their head. Well, is it a hat?
No,
Just
just
a yarmulke
Their
thing?
hair.
everything else is bald. They just leave a ring.
Oh yes, that's what it is. It's the when you enter an order, you know how you shave that little.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a way to, and I think this is significant, to separate yourself, right? You have this haircut that nobody else has, right? Unless you're like me and you're 47 and you're dealing with a little hair loss, right? Dude, you're holy. I love. I'm quoting this quote more often these days, but God made a few perfect heads, the rest He put hair on. So anyway, so this is the example of his writing to the people of his country. So this is 2 months later in a more theological track. And it's a more extended quote, I think. So this is the first. How then, if they are forced to admit that we are all equally priests, right? We are all, that's all believers. As many of us are all baptized, and by this we truly are. Well, to them is committed only the ministry and consented to by us. If they recognize this, they would know that they have no right to exercise power over us, except insofar as we may have granted it to them. For thus it says here's another quote of 1 Peter 2, right? You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a priestly kingdom.